Hello and welcome to this Debating Europe panel, where our experts respond to your questions and comments on Europe in this, the latest in a series of debates on the future of healthcare, run in partnership with MSD, called Healthcare Next. Today we are asking, should EU medicine supply chains be shorter and more sustainable? My name is Jackie Davis, and I'll be discussing this with Chantal Friedrichshäuser, Managing Director of MSD Germany, and Giacomo Mattino, Head of the Unit for Food, Retail and Health in the European Commission's Directorate General for the Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, better known in Brussels as DG GROW. A very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining me today. In this discussion, I'm going to be putting some of the questions that you, Debating Europe readers and viewers, have sent in. So let's crack on and we'll get through as many of them as we can in the next 30 minutes. Let us start with a question that goes straight to the heart of what we are talking about, and it's from González.
Hello, my name is Gonçalo Pizarro. And my question is, do you think that it's possible for all the supply chains to be shorter and sustainable?
So, Giacomo, what do you say to González? We know modern pharmaceutical supply chains are complex, they are global. Is it possible to make them simpler and shorter?
Well, thank you very much. A very interesting debate overall, and I think it starts really with a fantastic question. I think the quick reply to it is certainly it is possible. Is it desirable given the current circumstances? And secondly, of course, also what is important, I think, is to define what we mean by shorter and sustainable, because shorter just to exaggerate a bit, but shorter for a Finnish customer could mean something coming from Russia. I suppose that when we mean shorter from a Eurocentric perspective, we mean supply chains that are more centered, I would say, around the European Union. So possible, yes. Desirable, I'm not sure. I think I would like to further, to further qualify what I think about it, maybe as a follow-up.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to that in a moment. Chantal, a headline answer to that question. Giacomo is saying possible, yes. Desirable, question mark. What is your answer to González?
I guess the short answer would be shorter doesn't always mean sustainable, because then it comes back to the question of what does make a supply chain sustainable or not sustainable. And it can have so many different reasons, which mostly doesn't have to do with how lengthy the supply chain is.
But one of the questions, of course, just to follow up on that, is we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, those supply chain disruptions, shortages and so on. Is making supply chains shorter, Chantal, part of the answer to dealing with those disruptions, or are there other things you think we should be concentrating on to boost our resilience?
I think the resilience, actually COVID-19 is a very good example of that, because yes, we saw some supply chains of normal daily usage to be disrupted, but you didn't see that much in innovative pharmaceuticals or even in COVID-19 vaccines that have been created exactly within this time, which is just a testimony as well, because it was not the one with a shorter supply chain, but it is testimony of that the length of the supply chain is not the answer. And there are multiple reasons for a supply chain to be broken, and particularly if you have the length of vaccines or innovative therapeutics, then it has to do, on the one hand, it can happen that you have disruption or something happen on the line. And the production of these kind of products, particularly biotechnology and vaccines, is very complex with a lot of ingredients and a lot of steps, biological steps. And so if something happens, you have disruption, which has nothing to do with your supply chain, but with the processes of manufacturing of such complex products. But you have a multitude of other reasons for that without going into details. It can be that all of a sudden the demands come up and you didn't plan for it. All of a sudden you have, or you have less flexibility because of regulatory requirements. So it can have a multiple of reasons to tackle.
Let's come back to those reasons in more detail in a moment. But Giacomo, coming back to you, is part of your, is it desirable? You mentioned some of the reasons why it might not be, but is it also, if I could ask you this, the right question in terms of what we need to do, what we need to focus on? What do we need to be talking about here when it comes to dealing with shortages, disruptions? Is it really about shorter or is it about something else?
No, I think it's much more complex, and I think that Chantal highlighted very well a number of the issues at stake from the regulator perspective, but also I think there I join very much the business and even more in general stakeholder perspective. One has to say in Europe, do we want to have more resilience? Do we want to avoid shortages? And this applies, of course, to many ecosystems. We are focusing today clearly on the health one, on the medicines one. The reply, on one hand, is yes, we need to better analyze what are the criticalities and risks in case of, of disruptions. If the reply is, do we absolutely need shorter supply chain, I would say that's not necessarily the case, and we are going. So I would say reinforcing the EU understanding first, and then the production base. Probably this is an objective we all share. How to do it and the rationale to do it. I think it's a very challenging, I would say, and multi-factor analysis that needs to be done, because supply chain vulnerabilities are a multi-factor element. Just to mention, but very quickly, and I would like from that to take the conclusions of the very interesting structured dialogue, which was a multi-stakeholder platform who was working on those issues about a year ago. There is increasing complexity of pharmaceutical supply chain and specialization of manufacturing. There are challenges linked to production process and production technologies. We have heard Chantal mentioning that. We have dependencies which are combined with the lack of geographical diversification. It can be in certain cases and for certain products, but this is not generalized for sure. There is a lack of predictability of demand. And then there is also, let's be honest, a regulatory complexity and the lack at the global scale of international regulatory convergence. So all these are factors that merit to be taken into consideration when then deciding. And once again, I'm talking, of course, from a regulator perspective in what measures have to be taken. And I think the first conclusion you can have is that it's a number of issues that spans across a number of different phenomena.
Thank you. And we've got some questions from Debating Europe users that push a little bit more on this and give what they think are some of the potential reasons for this, and also what they think the consequences of not addressing this issue might be. So first, there is a question from Isabella who asks, today's global supply chain chaos demonstrates how we have to prioritize efficiency over resilience. Does this apply to medicine supply chains? And secondly, from Marco via video.
Hello, my name is Marco, and today we are using long supply chains, which are cheaper right now. But do you think that we are going to regret this cheap supply chain in the future? If yes, when?
If you are talking about innovative therapeutics and talking about vaccines, then the definition of efficiency would be very different. So we are not, the way we are building our supply chains is around a lot of technology expertise. And so I'm thinking of one example that we have in our portfolio at MSD. One of our vaccines requires 51 ingredients, will require to be grown biologically, It's not a chemical like it is for the generic drugs, for instance. And you go and build your supply chain around, for these 51 ingredients, where is the biggest know-how to make sure you have high quality product, and that will increase your effectiveness, let's say, in making sure in the shortest period of time you would have the highest quality standard that you are expecting to have. And so changing that from having 9 different sites to create these 51 ingredients that go together in one product at the end will not make it more sustainable to bring it only to one site or only to 2 sites, because you will not have the expertise you need to have the high quality standard that you require. So I think that's a very different lens that you put at that. And on top of that, thinking about innovative drugs and thinking about vaccines, actually the big majority, almost 80% of the ingredients come from Europe. And then the next big portion is coming from the United States. So I think there is this thinking process of, oh, everything is coming out of Europe, is not true when it comes to vaccines and when it comes to innovative drugs. I think it's important to bring that into perspective.
Giacomo, your answer to Marco and Isabella, in terms of why are they so long? Why are they so complex? Do you think efficiency and cost are the drivers? And if they are they the wrong drivers? Will we regret it?
No, I think that we have to look both at efficiency and resilience, and starting from the perspective of the reality of what the business model is, and we heard once again very well from Chantal. It's a globalized industry. We have to always not forget this element, and we are not going. I think, and nobody really wants to change that. Now, what I think it's very important, therefore, is to take both the cost factor, which is inevitably an important one, because after all, it is reflected on the final cost, of the product. So it means cost for the patient, it means cost for national, reimbursement schemes, all issues that in the current overall context of budget constraints, our member states are looking at very, very, very carefully. Maybe one thing I would like to add while listening to what Chantal brought forward as element is the fact that from a regulator perspective, we can not only focus on innovative medicines, we can not only focus on vaccines, we have to focus on the whole range of pharmaceutical products available, which makes the equation even more complicated because the reality, and we have heard that, is that very often the manufacturing processes or the way that value chains are organized can be very different. For generic medicines, of course, we are probably more dependent than from innovative ones from outside Europe. Is that a weak point or not? Once again, my comment would be not necessarily, but we have to set clear priorities on where we want to be resilient, when we want to avoid shortages, and not to, of course, and I mean, building on the lesson learned from the COVID-19, but also now from the ongoing Ukrainian war and the effects on supply chains of the Ukrainian war, not only on supply chain, but think about energy costs, which, energy, it's a big factor for any manufacturing endeavor. Then we have to certainly aim to reinforce the European, I think the European approach to supply chains and the European industrial base. How to do it? Once again, not necessarily at the cost, I mean, to simplify maybe too much, but not at the cost of forcing industry to relocate in Europe. It's a global industry. We have to take account of that. And by the way, we are also in regular dialogue with our main trading partners. Well, let me think and let me mention US as an obvious one. Also at regulatory level, we are in contact with them in order to have, I would say, a coherent approach to those issues.
Chantal, I'll let you come back on that relocation question in a moment, but I wanted to just bring in a couple more questions from Debating Europe users. The first from someone who prefers to remain anonymous, and this is all about the impact of those disruptions and making supply chain shortages, and it links to Giacomo's point about costs.
Hello, I have one question, and I would like to know how we can make the supply chain shorter but also cost effective. So I'm asking, can we make the supply chain shorter but still not so expensive for businesses?
Hi, my name is Javier, and I wanted to know, how do supply chain disruptions affect product prices? And how can European citizens deal with it?
And of course, Giacomo was pointing to industry costs earlier and saying, and costs for industry are also, of course, costs for the healthcare sector. So in terms of your costs and the impact on citizens, how do you see this issue, and how do we make sure we get this right so that we don't, in whatever we do to tackle disruptions, to manage supplies, we don't increase costs for the end user, the patient, the citizen?
That's a very good question. And I guess the biggest costs for citizens and for countries is when you don't have access to medicines that can save lives, that can help you going back to the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we all have a big interest from a cost point of view as well, from a financial point of view, to make sure we have the right medicines, the right vaccines available at the right time in the right way, in an effective way, of course. There are, I would say, many inefficiencies within the system that we can look at to reduce costs, but also to reduce the risk of shortages and to make the supply chain more resilient. And Giacomo pointed out to the regulatory, let's say, harmonization, because sometimes we are forced to use very different sides, because the way the regulatory process will go is that not only they would give you an approval for your product, but also for the way it is manufactured in one side. And so harmonizing that so that in country A, you would be eligible to receive the same product from one side and from the other would make change more resilient, for instance. So there is a lot of work to be done on the harmonization from that end. The other example I would like to mention in terms of inefficiency is we have to print patient leaflets in a lot of languages. And that is linked, the availability of the products will also be linked to the languages available in your product. So can we switch that? Can we move to electronic product information? You can imagine how much more flexible we would be in that frame. And then the third piece of inefficiency I would like to mention is stockpiling. And I know that stockpiling is coming from a very good intention, right? If I'm France, I'm Germany, I'm Italy, I'm Sweden, and I want to make sure for some critical medicines, my people would have access, then I would like to stockpile. But the reverse of what you want to have is happening, because you have medicines or vaccines sitting in a stock instead of being there available for the people who need it.
Chantal, I'll come back to you in a minute, Giacomo. Can I just follow up on one thing? I know you're developing also, when we talk about agility and flexibility, you're developing what you call portable on-demand manufacturing. So you can move it from place to place. But is that an additional cost, or in fact, is that an efficiency that helps you as well as responding to the crisis? Briefly, if you would, I was just intrigued by that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's tackling to one other element. So what I discussed before was more kind of the flexibility that you can bring into the system and regulatory system, for instance. You are touching upon innovation and how much innovation can contribute to this resiliency as well. I think the portable on demand are a very good example, because indeed, what we are trying to do by that is that we are trying to create, let's say, little manufacturing units that you can send to manufacture things on demand where you need it most. I do believe that's the future, but I do believe it's not the future for everything. I do believe it's a future for particularly pandemic preparedness. We learn from COVID-19, and I think the question is, what is the next and when is the next pandemic, and how can we make our systems more resilient, including manufacturing, to tackle that? And I think for me, that's one of the critical answers.
Thank you, Giacomo. I know you want to come back. I think maybe with a comment on stockpiling, one of the things, the issues that Chantal raised, but also to this broader question of cost.
Yes, no, absolutely, because once again, I think that Chantal identified the main drivers of reflection from a policy-making perspective. Now, let's maybe quickly let me refer to the regulatory environment, and this is valid both at multinational level, at global level, and of course, and very much at European level. Let's not forget that, Europe is not United States. It's a more complex reality. Let's think only about languages, just to mention one challenge that was mentioned by Chantal. So it's clear that now that we are entering a very important and interesting phase, because the Commission is undertaking right now the revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation, which will aim to look at innovation, including in digital technologies and novel and greening manufacturing methods, and to enhance the security of supply. So it's one of the aims, of course, easy to say, a bit more difficult now. Let's see what the result will be of the various elements. But one of the issues is certainly to continue the tendency to have, to equip the European Union with a better regulatory framework, building also on lessons learned from the COVID-19, and to make, for example, the approval process streamlined, to take advantage whenever possible of simplified language and labeling measures. I'm not sure we can move completely, to digital labeling, but technologies allows a lot of features there. Let's not forget that there we have as ultimate customers, if I may use this word, the citizens and the patients, which means a range of people from 0 to 100, and not all have the similar level of digital, I would say, education. But closing that parenthesis, now on the stockpiling, maybe one last word, and we are certainly learning, and member states are learning, that by acting in a more coordinated way, there is a definite added value, there is more efficiency, and there are less costs. And the HERA that also Chantal mentioned, it's an excellent example. Under the health emergency and responsiveness framework, we are building up a number of actions, and now I'm not referring to the ones that have a more, I would say, health policy aspect, but more those who have an industrial production aspect, because that's where supply chain security and let's say more robust system of production come into play. We are identifying and we are proposing a number of concrete actions that will certainly reinforce the EU capacity to respond. Maybe just one example,
very briefly, if you would,
very briefly, is the idea of the EU FAB, which is a network of manufacturing facilities that a number of group of manufacturers will reserve in case of emergency.
Thank you,
Giacomo. That's the idea.
I'm sorry to hurry you, but I did want to come back on one issue, and you talked about it right at the beginning when we heard shorter, when we asked, is it possible to make them shorter and sustainable? And you said shorter doesn't necessarily mean more sustainable. For you, what are the key issues in terms of meeting the sustainability challenge, briefly, if you would, that we need to address now. Same question then to you, Chantal, and then I'm going to put you all both on the spot with the final question. But Giacomo, sustainability, the key issues.
Yes, well, key issues really in a flash format certainly promote green and digital innovation in manufacturing to achieve enhanced security of supply. Precisely this, in my opinion, a very important element. And also to mention maybe one example is the support we are providing from the Commission side to an important project of common European interest for the health ecosystem, which of course, as you know, I mean, without entering into details, but is a special feature of state aid that would allow participating member states to provide financial support and trigger also more financial support for a number of very precise projects with high innovative factor. Well, this, in our opinion, will certainly contribute together with many other measures that we have mentioned to, to enhance the security of supply for Europe.
Thank you very much. And Chantal, can you give us some examples? I know this is a core issue for the pharmaceutical sector, some examples of what industry, what your company are doing, and what more needs to be done. How do you see the challenge ahead?
Right. I'm convinced that if we want to make supply chain more resilient, then we will need innovation, we need flexibility, and we need transparency. That's, for me, the three key elements. Innovation, we talked about the portable on-demand before, but what Giacomo talked about digitization, I think will really transform the way we can deliver, but also create the transparency around not only the supply, but also the demand. And I'm coming now to the point of transparency. I really do believe that because of data and digitization, we have a chance that we've never had before. And actually, my company is part of many working together with the FPR and with the European Commission in building a framework of transparency. But we need it from both ends, right? We need the supply transparency, being able to say, to predict what's happening in supply, but we need the same on the demand side, otherwise it's not worth it. And the last piece is around flexibility. And I think we talked about that, right? Like electronic patient leaflets, I like regulatory framework flexibility, but it's also meaning not creating new constraints that will kill the flexibility that we have today, like stockpiling or other ideas that we that might be here in terms also environmental framework, where we definitely want to have a good footprint, but some of the thoughts might be counterproductive as regards to flexibility.
So joined up thinking, absolutely essential to address these issues. I'm going to ask you something very unfair now, but we've covered a lot of ground in the last 30 minutes or so. And I just wanted to ask each of you, of all the issues we've discussed, and Giacomo, I'll come to you first. If you had to identify your top priority, the key next step, as it were, to address the concerns that we've heard from Debating Europe viewers and readers, and ensure that we genuinely have more resilient and sustainable supply chains in future, what would it be? 1 minute each. Giacomo first, then Chantal.
A very difficult 1 million question, but I'll try to reply. But having in mind that the issues, as we have seen in our discussion, are heavily interconnected. So I would say, number one, certainly now building up a regulatory environment that is up to the challenges. And secondly, I would say work in what I would define as a rational and mindful reinforcing of the EU industrial base, while still, of course, being aware that it's a global industry and that, flexibility and capacity to react and therefore resilience remain important features for this industry. So for me, these are the two issues I would put at the top.
Thank you. So very much a case of watch this space for that review of the pharmaceutical legislation and what comes out of it to address those issues. Chantal, I know it's an impossible question as well to you, but your key priority for yourselves and more broadly.
I think I mentioned that in the prior question, saying, well, these are the three elements, right? It's innovation, it's transparency, and it's flexibility. But if I would put one on top, I would say, and Giacomo mentioned that, the research-based pharmaceutical industry in particular is a leading industry for Europe, not only for the products it's providing and the health it's helping to provide, but also as an industry. And so I do believe that if not there, where should we not work together? So I would be pledging for partnership. I would be pledging for bringing the relevant people together and say, what are our common objectives and how do we create a frame like the one I just described around how to build transparency of supply as well as of demand, so that we have a common ground that will help us bring together resiliency of the supply chain to a different level.
Thank you. And I think today's discussion has been a demonstration of that partnership in action. Thank you both very much for such a full and frank discussion. And thank you for answering those questions from Debating Europe viewers and readers so clearly. Thank you to all of you for watching, and to those of you who sent in the questions that enriched our discussion, a particular thanks. As I said at the start, this is just one in a series of online discussions that Debating Europe is running on the future of healthcare. If you would like to continue that debate, you can leave your questions or indeed your comments on the Debating Europe website, and you can check out the other debates in this series. And look out for the next one coming up soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.